Hi, today I'm gonna show you how to knit this two colors brioche hat in round. Let's get started. Please check my description box for details. I put the link you might need, such as my website for written pattern. Okay, so this is very basic decreasing method, two colors brioche hat. A lot of people don't even want to try to knit brioche because if this is first time, it's a little bit complicated. But once you know how it works, it's not that difficult. Anyway, there's lots of, complicated brioche knit. However, this is so easy, especially decreasing part. I just decrease one line and everything else is all same. And this brioche is actually reversible. You can wear hat inside out. And as you can see, inside and outside, big difference is whichever you want to put outside, different color of knitting stitch. This side, orange is the knitting stitch, and inside, yellow is knitting stitch. Anyway, to knit this project perfectly, obviously you need to knit brioche swatch, which I did. And again, I put the link in my description box how to knit brioche in flat because it's different. So you might want to watch that video first to knit your swatch. Anyway, I started with the 20 cast, and which is about 4.5. And the important thing for this brioche knitting, you have to remember this brioche stretch a lot. So when you count the stitches, you have to decide how tight you want. Another word, how loose you want. Obviously, if you don't stretch the swatch before you count, it's going to be loose hat. But seriously, it's going to be very loose. So I stretch my swatch a lot, 4.5 to 6 inch. Then I count the stitches. Well, I already know because, I started with 20 stitch. So my gauge is within 6 inch, I have 20 stitches. Then I did the math. My cast on number is 70 stitches to start according to my math. And here comes my math. First of all, my head measurement is 21 inches and my gauge is I have 20 stitches within 6 inch because I stretch them out, right? So the math is 6 inches versus 20 stitches equal 21 inches my head measurement versus X stitches, which is my cast on. So X equal 20 times 21 divided by 6. X equal 70. So my cast on number is 70. However, now you have to look at the cast on rule. The cast on rule is only one. The number has to be multiple of 8 or more. However, this number has to be even number. For example, the number has to be multiple of 8, 10, 12, or 14, something like that. And my cast on number is 70, so this is multiple of 10. So I don't have to adjust anything. However, if your cast on number is, let's say, 71, you have to adjust to 70, something like that. Now, let's move on to knitting. These two colors are the one I used. I am going to say orange yarn is my main color and yellow should be contrast color. Cast on 70 according to my math. I don't know your cast on number, but make sure you make cast on according to your math. So, cast on should be with your main color. And after this, there's 2 setup rows. Setup row number 1, main color. Make sure you're on the right side. I am going to join both ends, which means I am going to start knitting in round. And I'm going to use magic loop technique because I didn't have right length of the cable. Anyway, starting with main color, which is orange, and just all knit 1 round. And key for brioche, focus. That's all I can say. I started watching TV while I'm knitting and I made mistakes. So just focus. All right? And set up row number 2 with contrast color. Let me finish the row number 1 here and change the color. However, the contrast color, which is yellow for me, hasn't been attached. So it's a little bit tricky. First of all, the orange working yarn is at the back and the pattern is repeat of yarn front. However, the yellow yarn is not attached yet, right? So you just have to pretend that the yarn is front, like that. Just hold it, right? And make sure this yarn has to be out front. And slip 1 purlwise, then wrap around with the right needle, then purl 1. That's it. And again, I want to make sure the end yarn has to be out front. That's all you have to remember. And then if the end yarn is kind of, bugs you, you can tie the knot really lightly if you want. There you go. From the second, third row, you don't really have to worry because now the both color attached. And as you can see, the first stitch is now brioche stitch. Brioche stitch is 1 independent and 1 yarn over. That's the brioche stitch. Anyway, yarn front, slip 1 purlwise, wrap around, then purl 1. Whenever you wrap, you create the brioche stitch. So you just have to repeat with some bracket. Okay, wrap and purl 1. Yarn front and slip 1 purlwise, wrap the working yarn around right needle. See, it's a brioche stitch. Then purl 1. And you just have to repeat until the begin marker. That's about it. And here is end of row, set up row number 2. Okay, yarn front, then slip 1 purlwise, wrap, purl 1, and slip 1, wrap, purl 1. Now, row number 1, if all the yarn tangled, make sure it's all good. And the yellow working yarn has to be at the back now because I'm going to use orange, main color. Row number 1. Do you remember? The first stitch is brioche stitch. And people usually count brioche stitch as 1 stitch, but I am going to count 2 stitch. So brioche knitted together, right? And then repeat kicks in, yarn front, and that's an independent stitch. So slip 1 purlwise, then keep the working yarn at front, then next brioche stitch, brioche knitted together. Yarn front, slip 1 purlwise, keep the working yarn front, and brioche knitted together. And you just keep repeating. And at the end, it's a little tricky, so I want to talk about it. So just repeat with some blanket. And again, brioche stitch, which is 1 independent, and yarn over stitch, I count as 2 stitch. People usually count 1 stitch. Anyway, so let's finish row number 1 until 1 last stitch. And right now, you don't even know what you're knitting because it's only, the first row. Anyway, yarn front and slip 1 purlwise and brioche knitted together. Again, yarn front, slip 1 purlwise, brioche knitted together. And here comes last 1 stitch. Okay, last 1 stitch, yarn front and slip 1 purlwise. But the tricky part is this working yarn with orange creates the brioche at the end. So make sure the orange working yarn is at the back and create the brioche. And now yellow, row number 2. Easy. Yarn front, slip 1 purlwise and wrap, then now not purl 1, brioche purl 2 together. There you go, because I create the brioche stitch on row number 1. Okay, so yarn front, slip 1 purlwise, wrap and brioche purl 2 together. One more time. Yarn front, slip 1 purlwise, wrap, then purl 2 together, brioche purl 2 together until the end. Because it was a little bit tricky at the end of the row number 1 with the orange working yarn. So I just want to make sure you understand or not. Okay, so wrap and brioche purl 2 together, slip 1 purlwise, wrap and brioche purl 2 together, and okay, and yarn front, slip 1 purlwise, wrap, and there you go. There's only 1 stitch, right? No, with the orange working yarn has to be at the back like that to create the brioche on row number 1. So you have to do brioche purl 2 together at the end. So that's what you have to be very careful. And you just repeat row number 1 and row number 2 until your desired length, which is cover your head at least. So anyway, I'm starting to repeat row number 1. So, okay, let's see, yarn front, slip 1 purlwise, then brioche knitted together. And if you knit few more rows, the brioche knitting texture will show. So just hang on tight. So just keep knitting row number 1 and row number 2. And here comes, I knitted it about 6 inches from the bottom. And this is pretty much my desired length, 6.5. And just covered, but obviously I'm not closing on top of my head yet. So I am going to decrease some stitch every row, every second row, I believe, right? So now let's prepare for decreasing. You have to add some markers. My cast count is multiple of 10. The whole cast number was 70, right? So I added the markers every 10 stitches. So another word, if your whole stitch count is multiple of 12, you have to add every 12 stitches. And starting with brioche and end with independent stitch. All right? And I just want you to make sure how you count. I said brioche stitch consider as 2 stitch. However, when you count here, please count brioche stitch as 1 stitch, because the brioche is temporary 2 stitch because the 1 independent and yarn over. Again, when you count for decreasing marker, please count brioche stitch as 1 stitch. Anyway, now I have 10 stitches in between markers. And on the first row, which is knitting row, I am going to decrease 2 stitches. If I decrease only 1 stitch at a time, the pattern will be changed. So please make sure you will decrease 2 stitch at a time. And then every 10 stitch, I am going to decrease 2 stitch. I'll show you, so don't worry about it. Right after the marker, every marker, I will decrease 2 stitch. So let's start. Decrease row number 1, main color. First brioche stitch, slip, knitwise, and working yarn has to be at the back like that. And then next 3 stitch, which is 1 brioche stitch and 1 regular independent stitch. You have to do knit 3 together. There you go. So knit 3 together, I decrease 1 stitch there, and then brioche stitch I count as 1 PSSO. So I decrease 2 right there. And this block decreasing is done. And after that, same as row number 1. So yarn front, slip 1 purlwise, and knit brioche. There you go. Until next marker. Here comes. And then last stitch, yarn front this time. Okay, because the first begin marker, that's a, different row. All right, you know what I'm saying? Because the before the begin marker is the end of the row number 2, right? But this one, same row, both row number 1. So this time from the second marker, yarn front and slip 1 purlwise. Okay, and then what you have to do, you have to decrease again. And you know what, I am going to change the marker because the clip-on type was a little bit tough to knit, so I changed it. And then right after the marker, I will decrease. So do not do brioche knitted together. Yarn front, slip brioche stitch, and then keep the yarn front this time, then knit 3 together, 1 brioche and 1 independent, and then PSSO. So pass the brioche stitch over. There you go. So only difference is the begin marker, the working yarn was at the back. And after that, regular row number 1. No more decreasing, right? The second batch decrease has done. So let's do that one more time. The last independent stitch, right? So I'm getting ready for marker. I want to change. So yarn front, slip 1 purlwise, and I'm sorry, I'm going to change the marker, and keep the yarn front, then slip brioche stitch knitwise, then knit 3. And right now you have to be very careful with working yarn. Don't cross over the marker. You should go behind the marker because I have to create the brioche stitch, the one before the marker. Then PSSO, the pass the slip stitch over. And you gotta do same thing every marker until the end. So here is decreasing row number 1 at the end. There we go. And same, right? So the last one stitch, yarn front, slip 1, and then working yarn, kind of, hold it at the back. Then decreasing row number 2, nothing changed. Same as regular row number 2. So yarn front, slip 1 purlwise, wrap, and brioche purl 2 together. So the decreasing is happened on row number 1, not row number 2. And row number 3, also row number 4. So decreasing row is repeating of row number 1 until row number 4, and row number 3 is just the same as row number 1, not the decreasing. And decreasing row number 4 is same as row number 2. Okay, so repeating row number 1 to row number 4, and the pattern is same as the regular, except row number 1 has decreasing pattern. Okay, now I want to talk about the yarn movement around the markers. I just finished the one block, and now second block, right? I slip 1 purlwise and I have to wrap. But when you wrap, if I go behind the markers, that's big no-no. if you're on row number 2. You have to come out front of the markers because I want to create the brioche stitch, the one with I just slipped. One stitch before the marker looks like an independent stitch, right? That's because I did the brioche purl-two together. So that's not the stitch I am going to create the brioche. This is the one, right? I am going to do the brioche purl-two together and slide the marker, and this is the one I slipped, right? One stitch, and that's the one I have to create the brioche stitch for next row. So you really have to think which stitch I am going to create brioche stitch for next row. And I want to show you now one mistake. This is, the purl row number 2, right? And now yarn front, but I forgot to wrap it. If I forgot to wrap, here comes the yellow yarn come out front over the orange knit stitch. So when you're knitting and then, different color of yarn is showing on the surface like this, which means you forgot to wrap. You know what I'm saying? So this, yarn movement, yarn front, yarn back, it's important. All right? And this is actually decreasing row number 2 I'm doing, and I talked about little tip here and there I'm trying to fix. And fixing brioche mistake is really hard, so you don't want to make mistake. And now decreasing row number 3, I told you row number 3 is same as row number 1. So kind of, repeating row number 1 and row number 2. However, every 4 rows I want to decrease, right? So I change the row count, right? And as I say, row 3 is same as row number 1, but no decreasing. And decreasing row number 4 is same as decreasing row number 2. Then repeat row number 1 to row number 4 until 2 stitches left in between every markers. Okay, so I'm gonna give you my example. I have 10 stitches in between markers, right? And I am going to decrease until 2 stitches left. So 10 minus 2 is 8. So I am going to decrease 8 stitches. However, I'm going to decrease 2 stitches every row number 1. So 8 divided by 2 is 4. I am going to decrease 4 times. 4 times row number 1, right? But I am going to repeat row number 1 to row number 4, which is 4 row, right? So 4 times 4 is 16. So when I start decreasing row, I am going to knit 16 more row to finish top of the head. So everybody has different stitch count at the begin, right? So that's how you think how many more rows you will be knitting from now. So you kind of have to do the little math in your head, and then if you want to adjust the length, maybe you need to knit more, or if you knit too many rows, it's really hard to fix. So it's too late. but that's how you kind of decide when to stop. When to start decreasing. All right? And again, I'm actually telling you right now, same thing, decreasing row number 1 to row number 4, repeating, right? And I guess this is the decreasing row number 1, so I'm showing you the how to decrease again. At the very beginning, the yarn has to be at the back and slip brioche stitch, then knit 3 together, which is 1 brioche and 1 independent. And then PSSO, pass the brioche stitch, the slip stitch, over. There we go. At the very beginning, yarn has to be front. That's what you have to remember. Okay? And after 2 stitch decreasing, in this block, you just do row number 1 pattern until the last one before the marker, and one last one, yarn front and slip 1 purlwise, slide the marker and slip the brioche stitch because you have to do the decreasing again, so don't knit. Okay, then knit 3 together. These 3 means 1 brioche stitch and 1 independent, and then PSSO, and do the same thing, and every marker you have to decrease. And I meet you at the end. There you go. I guess 2 stitches in between markers, 1 independent and 1 brioche. This is what I did. When 2 stitches left after I did last decreasing row number 1, I didn't stop. I did 2 more rows, decreasing row number 2 and 3. It's really up to you. You can actually stop right after the decrease 1, but I didn't want to. So I did decreasing row number 2 and 3. It's really up to you. And then this is over. After I did the decreasing row number 3, cut the yarn and get the tapestry needle and then close the gap right on the top of your hat. I use the 2 thread, both orange and yellow thread, to close the gap on top. And this is super easy. And again, brioche knitting has so many variety, and this is just the beginning, very basic. And sometimes, in the future I kind of want to knit a little bit more brioche, but it's gonna be long video, so I kind of avoid it, but maybe in the future I'll think about it a little bit more. Anyway, so again, this is the kind of reversible, but the main color shows more decreasing line, which is this one, right? The one I'm showing, that's the decrease line, and every other line goes kind of towards to the decreasing line, right? Anyway, this is it. If this is your first time brioche, you really have to practice. So please watch my other brioche knitting tutorial video and do little bit practice. All right? Enjoy knitting. Bye for now.